These contraptions are really cool to look at. So today we're going to be using simulation nodes to create the same, all within Blender, customizable to exactly your requirements. It's going to be a bit longer than usual, so we'll have timestamps just like every other video on my channel. So with that, let's begin the tutorial. In our default scene, we're going to go ahead and just set up the main contraption. For that, we can take this default cube, press SZ0.1, and then again SY, maybe something like 3, and maybe we can scale it on the x-axis by pressing SX2, which will act as our base for the contraption. Next, we'll press Shift A and search for a mesh cube, and we'll press 7 to go into the top view, after which we can press S0.1 to scale it down by 0.1 units, and then we can scale it up on the y-axis by maybe 20 units, after which we can just grab it on the x-axis by -1, and then press Alt D to create a linked duplicate, and then move it on the x-axis by tapping X and tapping 2 to move it on the other side. Now we have both the versions present right there, but they're currently underneath the base plane. So let's select both of them and just tap 1 to go into the front view, and then press GZ 0.2 to move them up on the z-axis by 0.2 units. Now since these are going to act as rails on which our main contraption will move along, we need this to have some sort of indentation. So we can press tab to go into edit mode, and remember, because we pressed Alt D, they're linked duplicates, so any change that we make in edit mode on this one will also appear on this one as well. So now we can press Ctrl R and just place our cursor such that we get a loop cut along this axis, and then use our scroll wheel to add another loop cut. And once you have 2 loop cuts, you can tap enter twice. After that, you can select the faces by pressing this button up here and going into face select mode, selecting this top face, and then pressing Alt E and choose extrude manifold. Then you can just grab this down and you create the channel on which our main contraption can move along. In case you were wondering why we used extrude manifold, I'll just show you why. And that's because if we were to just press EZ and extrude it, you get this face over here, and that becomes quite an issue to remove, because even if you delete this particular face, you see you have this whole face, and deleting that face causes a hole down here. So it's really hard to create it by just extruding. Similarly, if we were to choose any of these other options, you have the same issue. So that's why we had to press extrude manifold to get what we want. Once we're done with that, we can go ahead and create the base on top of which the rest of the contraption will lay. So we'll press tab to go into object mode again, press Shift A, mesh cube, and then again S0.1, 7 to go into the top view. This time we'll just press SX and bring it up till it's slightly larger than these 2 cubes, and we can also press 1 to go into the front view so that we can see where the position of these holes are. So we can press GZ to move it up, and I think it's a bit too tall on the z-axis as well, so I'll press SZ 0.5 and then SX and just bring it slightly larger than the holes. After that, I'll press tab to go into edit mode, and I'll just select this face over here, turn over to the other side and shift select this particular face, then press 1 again, then press E enter so that we now have a duplicate of each of the faces, after which you can press SX and just bring it up a bit like that, and then press E again, enter, SX, and just bring it out. Then we can go and select the bottom of these 2 faces, so this face over here, and shift select this face over here, and then again press 1, E, and just grab it down. So there we have this particular object on which we can add the rest of it. So let's press Shift A, search for a cylinder, press S0.1 as usual. Maybe it can go even lower, S0.5 again, then GZ, grab it up, press 1 to go into your front view, SZ2, GZ, and this should be good enough. Beyond that, I also want this to be shaded smooth, so I'll right click, shade auto smooth. Then we can add the final cube or plane on top from which all the particles will emit. So I'll press Shift A, mesh cube, scale 0.05, GZ, and then just bring it to this particular tip. After that, I can press 7 to go into the top view. Now I'm going to scale it on the y-axis by maybe 2 units, and then scale it on the x-axis by maybe 20 units. And this is essentially from which all my particles are going to be emitting. Next, we can set all of our animation defaults before we start animating. So let's go to our output properties, change the frame rate to 60 frames per second. End frame can be 600 so that it's a 10-second long animation. Output folder, we're going to choose whatever we want it to be. File format, we're going to choose FFmpeg video. Encoding, we're going to change the container to MPEG-4, and output quality, we're going to choose perceptually lossless. Then for the actual animation, we want this to rotate about the z-axis while this moves along the y-axis like this. We also require all of these to move along with each other. So let's select these 2, then shift select this one at the end and press Ctrl P, set parent to object. So now if we animate this along the y-axis, the rest of it follows. But we also require this to rotate about the z-axis. So I'll press Shift A and search for an empty plane axis. Now I'll just scale them up so that I can see it much better. After that, I'll select this particular object and I'll go to the constraint properties over here, and then I'll just add in an object constraint and I'll choose copy rotation. For the target, I'll choose the new empty that I created, and then I'll expand my timeline and add in keyframes for the rotation of this empty. So let's select the empty, go back to frame 0 and tap I rotation, and then by around frame 150, I'll press RZ 360 so that it makes one full rotation, and then I'll tap I rotation. So that way it rotates one full rotation, but you see it slows down at the beginning and the end. So I'll come down here, press A, T, linear, and that way it should rotate at a constant speed. Now I feel like this rotation is maybe a bit too fast, so I'll just take this and press G and move it over to 300 so that we do one rotation in 300 frames. So that seems like a much better speed, but the problem is after frame 300 it just stops. To make this continue, we can press A to select everything and press Shift E and choose make cyclic. So that way it's going to continue rotating even after frame 300, and even if we choose to make the animation much longer, it's going to continue rotating and we don't need to bother about that. Now that we have that set, we can deal with the animation for this particular base. So let's go to frame 0 and press 7 to go into the top view. Let's press GY and move it down by maybe -2 units, and that brings it to the absolute edge. So maybe let's not go for -2, let's go for -1.8, and then we'll just tap I location, and then we'll go to frame 150, which is halfway through the 360 rotation that our top does, and then we'll press GY and move it by twice the distance that we just moved it by, but in the positive direction. So 1.8 into 2, which is 3.6, and then tap I location, and then on frame 360 we'll take this original one, press Shift D and move it down to about there. Then we'll tap A to select all of these, press T, linear, and now we should have an animation where this goes all the way to this end and then comes back down to this particular end. But the problem is that it just stops. So again, press Shift E, make cyclic. And now we have an infinite motion where this keeps moving to this side, and we have this rotating as well as we move from one side to the other. So this looks perfectly all right. And we can finally start off with the actual particle animation, which is going to be the simulation node section. The first thing that we need is an actual object from which the simulation will occur. So let's press 7 to go into the top view, press Shift A and search for a mesh plane. Now let's make the plane roughly the same size as this cube that we had on top. So I'll press SY and just bring it down to roughly the same size. If you want to make sure that it's perfectly the same, just press GY and bring it over here, and you can see that it is the same size as the original cube that we had, which was over here. So since it is the same size, we can now press Alt G to clear its location again, and it's very important to press Ctrl A and apply all transforms. If you do not apply all transforms by pressing Ctrl A, or especially the scale, the simulation nodes will be slightly messed up and you won't get results as you expect. So once you've done that, you can go ahead and bring your cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and change this from the timeline to the geometry node editor. Then press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree, zoom in and move this group input to the side. Next, we need to actually place this object on top of this particular object. So let's just press this pin button so that no matter what object we choose, this geometry node tree remains. So the first thing that we have to do is actually make sure that this plane is located at the same place as this cube. So we can take the cube from the outliner and drag and drop it in so that we get access to the location of this cube. We also get access to the rotation. Now to actually move this plane to its position, we press Shift A and search for a transform geometry node and plug that in right here, and take the location and plug it into the translation. The rotation as well, we can plug into the rotation, and we can choose relative so that when this object moves, the plane will move along with it. Now let's go ahead and select the plane, and you can see that the plane has come to the correct position and is taking on the correct rotations as well. However, it's currently present in the middle of the cube. We need it to be on top. So to change that, we can just search for a set position node, plug that in after the transform geometry, and just offset it on the Z by 0.05. And that way it comes just to the top, exactly where we want it. Now we need to actually start emitting particles from this plane. So let's move the group output more towards the side and press Shift A and search for a distribute points on faces node. Now we can change the density according to what we want. So I'll go with maybe a density of 20. And for every frame, I want this seat to change. So I'll press Shift A and search for a scene time node and take the frame output and plug it into the seat. So that way we get new points being distributed every single frame. Then we need to actually add in more points while keeping the previous points. For that, we press Shift A and search for a simulation zone. Then we take the output from this distribute points on faces and plug it into the geometry, and take this output and plug it into the group output. Then we press Shift A and search for a join geometry so that we can have the new points as well as the old points. And now we can plug this in right here, and we should get new points being added in every single frame. So that looks great, but it would look even better if these points move up on the Z-axis. So that's very easy to do. We just press Shift A and search for a set position node, plug that in after the join geometry and offset it on the z-axis by a very small amount. So let's go with 0.01, and there we have the base for this particular simulation. So that looks exactly like what I wanted to do. So we can go ahead and start optimizing the scene even more. The first thing is that these particles are going to go way out of frame very soon, but they still exist and Blender has to calculate them, so it becomes much slower. If you have a longer animation, it's going to slow down really badly, so we need to kill particles that go outside the frame. So for that, we need to first figure out the age of every particle. So we need to create a new attribute, so I'll press Shift A and search for a capture attribute node. I can just plug that in over here, and I'll take this geometry and plug that into the join geometry instead of this original output, so I'll just remove that connection. Now, I want to capture the age, which is going to be an integer, so I'll change this from float to integer, and I'll keep the value at 0 itself, because when a point is created, the value should be 0. Now I'll take this attribute and plug it into the input of the simulation zone, so that we now have the attribute as well, which we can manipulate inside the simulation zone. But we don't want to just call it attribute, so I'll go to the node tab over here, go down to the simulation state. Remember, you have to have simulation input selected, and then you can change the name from attribute to age, and in case this panel isn't present, you have to tap N to bring it out. Now, each frame, we need the age to be changed before it goes into the output. So we press Shift A and search for a math node, and we'll simply add a value of 1 to the age. So let's plug the age into the first socket and take this output and plug it into the simulation output. So now every single time the age goes in and 1 is added, and we have the age of the particles. We have the output as well, which we can use later on for actually texturing these particles. Next, to actually delete the particles that are older than a certain age, we can press Shift A and search for a delete geometry node, plug that in over here, and we need to choose a selection. For the selection, we search for a compare node and compare the age with a value. So if the age is greater than, let's say, 250, then we can go ahead and just delete the particle. So we plug that into the selection. So every particle that has an age greater than 250 will be deleted. So let's go ahead and go back to frame 0 so that the animation or the simulation is reset, and then press play to actually see the animation. You can notice that after we cross frame 250, all of these particles just start getting deleted. And since this is outside the camera view, it should be alright. In case after we place the camera it's inside, we can go ahead and just increase this greater than node, and the number will start increasing. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and instance something onto these points so that they're not just points and they can actually be seen even if you were in rendered view without any overlays. So to fix that, we press Shift A and search for an instance on points node. We can plug that in after the simulation output, and then for the instance, we press Shift A and search for an icosphere, and we reduce the radius down to something really small. Let's go with 0.01. Maybe increase the subdivisions to 2 and plug the mesh into the instance. That way we have these nice little icospheres present that go up. However, we can actually store the age as an attribute so that we can give older particles a different color. So I'll press Shift A and search for a store named attribute, plug that in over here. We'll call the name age, so AGE, and it's going to be an integer. So let's plug that in and just take the age and plug it into the value. So now the age is stored for every single point in an attribute named age. After that, we can go ahead and just set material. So let's bring this over to the side, go to the material panel, add in a new material, press Shift A, search for a set material node, plug that in right here and choose this material. Let's name this particles and choose particles over here. Once you're done with that, you can actually start texturing the different objects. So that's going to be fairly simple. Let's switch over to our shader editor, choose particles, let's remove this pin, and we'll switch our viewport shading to rendered. We'll go to our render properties, switch on bloom and screen space reflections. For the bloom, I want to clamp it down at a value of 5, and I want to reduce the intensity to 0.02 so that it's not too intensive of a bloom. Next, for particles, if you can't see the nodes, just press period on your numpad to centralize them. Let's go ahead and select principled PSDF and tap X to delete it. I want these to be emissive, so I'll press Shift and search for an emission node, and I'll plug the emission into the surface. For the color, however, I want to use a gradient, so I'll search for a color ramp node, and I want to actually control the factor of this color ramp using the age of the particles. So let's go ahead and press Shift A and search for an attribute node, and the type, we're going to use instancer because it was a different value for every instance. For the name, remember we saved it as age, so we'll call it age, and we're just going to use this factor. But remember, the age starts off at 0, goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on and so forth. But the actual factor over here goes from 0 to 1. So that way, we're not going to get exactly what we want. So let's go ahead and change this from 0 to a max age of 250 because we're killing everything after 250, and just remap it to 0 to 1. So I'll press Shift A, search for a map range node, plug that in over here. Now we know that it's going from an age of 0 to an age of 250, but we want the factor to go from 0 to 1. So that way you can see we do have black values over here that are slowly going towards the white value up there. Next, we don't want it to be black and white. So maybe I'll say it should go from a green value to a blue value. So let's make this green and let's go ahead and select this white slider and make it blue. Then let's just increase this emission strength to something like 100. And that way you have your particles. I can always bring in the green a bit more and just play around with this if I feel like it's necessary. Once I'm happy with the particles, I can go ahead and go to the material properties, switch off shadows by going to the shadow mode and choosing none, because these particles are emitting light, so they shouldn't be casting shadows. Then let's quickly add materials for everything else in the scene. So let's select the base plane. We'll change the name of the material to base because we used the default cube to create this. So it already had the default material added to it. For the base, we're just going to make it completely metallic so it's nice and reflective. Roughness we can reduce to 0.3. And to actually give it some more character, we can press Shift A, search for a Voronoi texture. We can change this from F1 to distance to edge and plug the distance into the roughness. To have better control, we can press Shift A and search for a color ramp node, plug that in over here, and then start playing with the scale. I'm also going to reduce the randomness down to 0 so that it's perfect squares. And now you should be able to see them appear. I also have scaled this up randomly in different directions, so this doesn't appear to be squares. So I can just select this, press Ctrl T and change this from generated to object. Remember, Ctrl T works only if you have Node Wrangler enabled. If you don't, you can go to your preferences and enable Node Wrangler, or you can just add in a mapping and texture coordinate nodes manually. Now that looks better. I'm going to reduce the scale to maybe 10 and I'll just play around with these values. And I don't want any area to be completely reflective or completely non-reflective, so I'll change this black to a value of 0.2 and I'll change this white to a value of maybe 0.7. So that's it for my base material. I think I can give this cube over here that's emitting these particles the same material. So I'll select it, Shift select this one, Control L, link materials. Now it's changed randomly because again, this was scaled and I haven't applied the scales. So I can actually press Control A and apply all transforms. So the shading becomes proper, but I feel like maybe I need to change the scale a little bit here and there just to get what I want, or I need to play around with my color ramp node. So I think that's better. Next, for all of these, we can just add in some vertical lines. So I'll press new to add in a new material, call this emission lines. Press period on your numpad to centralize the nodes. As usual, I'll make it very metallic and I'll reduce the roughness down to 0.3. And I'll just select this, Shift select this and press Ctrl L, link materials. Next, I'll press Shift A and search for a wave texture. With Node Wrangler enabled, I can press Ctrl T and switch this from generated to object. Then I can Ctrl Shift click it to actually preview what the wave texture looks like. And clearly the wave texture is on the wrong axis. So I'll change this from X to Z and that way we'll get horizontal lines, but the scale is way too high. So let's reduce the scale to 0.1 and that way we just get this one line. Let's use a color ramp node to crunch it in. So let's press Shift A, search for a color ramp, plug that in over here. Now let's just bring the black in, bring the white in, and maybe I'll Control click to add in a new stop over here and change this stop's color from white to black as well. And let's just bring this in. And now I get two bright lines, which could be fairly cool. Let's actually just increase the scale by a little bit so that the lines come down and that looks great. Now let's change this from a white to maybe a greenish color because I'm going to use this directly in the color of the emission. So now let's plug this color into the emission color. And for the emission strength, I can make it something really high like 100 and then Control Shift click the principled BSDF to see it. Or you can just connect the principled BSDF into this material output. So that looks great. However, because we applied all transforms to this particular cube, the origin does come back to the center, which is why our emission plane is also emitting from down there. So let's just go back to the geometry node editor, select this geometry node object and use this offset to bring it back up. If you want to actually prevent having to redo this, you could have actually gone to the physics properties simulation nodes and just baked the simulation after saving the Blender file. And that way the simulation would not have changed even after applying the transforms. So I think a value of 0.75 is good enough to bring it back to the top. And to prevent any further accidental changes, I'm actually going to go ahead and save this file and bake it. So let's press Ctrl S to save it. And once it's saved, I can go ahead and bake the animation. Remember that before you bake it itself, you have to make sure that the number of particles is perfectly all right and exactly the way you want it to be. If you want to make changes after you bake it, you have to use this little delete button over here to delete the previous bake, and then you'll be able to make changes to the simulation, or at least the changes to your simulation will actually show. Now the last object that we still haven't actually given a material to is this little cylinder. So let's just add in a new material by changing to the shader editor again and pressing this new button. And I'm just going to make this very metallic, and that should do. Next, I'll press Shift A and search for a mesh plane, which is going to act as our floor and background. So let's just bring it up to something like that. Then press Tab to go into edit mode. Make sure that you have overlays on so that you can see what you're doing. Let's go to the edge select mode and just select these two edges. Press EZ and bring it up so that you get nice walls. Next, let's go ahead and give this a new background material, and we're just going to make it very much metallic, and then press Shift A, search for a Voronoi texture and a noise texture. This is again a background that we've done in multiple previous videos, maybe such as this one, in case you're interested in creating DNAs as well. Then along with the Voronoi texture, we're going to search for a noise texture, and the noise texture is going to go as the input to the Voronoi texture. Next, to control the Voronoi texture, we press Shift A and search for a color ramp node, plug the color into the factor, and take this color and plug it into the roughness. Next, we just play around with the scales, and in case you feel like there's stretching happening, as usual, press Ctrl T to add in the texture coordinate and mapping nodes and switch this over to object. Next, just play around with the scale of the noise texture and the Voronoi texture. I think this looks pretty cool, and I might just give a distortion value of 0.1 so that we get these nice swirls, and that looks nice. Beyond that, just like before, I don't want any area to be completely reflective or completely non-reflective, so I'll change this to a value of 0.1, and I'll take this and change this to a value of 0.8. Next, I'll go to my world properties and change the background color all the way to black, and I'll select my light and remove it. So I can also just select it and delete it because I do not need the light. Next, I'll have to place my camera, so let's select the camera, press Alt G and Alt R to clear location and rotation. Then I'll press RX90 to rotate it on the X-axis by 90 degrees, followed by RZ45, and then I'll press 0 to go into my camera view. Then I'll press GZ and just bring it up, and then GZ twice to move it back on the local Z axis, and then again GZ to bring it up on the global Z, and maybe I can rotate it on the local X axis by pressing RX twice, and just move it around till you feel like it's at an appropriate location. Once you have it at an appropriate location, you can make sure that these particles are not being deleted before they cross out of the camera view, and if that's the case, you can always change the max age of the particles before they get deleted. Make sure that you centralize everything properly, and once you're happy with the way everything's looking, you can go ahead and press render animation. Just before exporting, I thought I'd talk about a few other things that you could do with this setup. The first being, in the geometry node tree for these trails, if you actually go down to the seed value for the different distribute points on faces node and remove the scene time so that you just have a constant seed, instead of getting a random distribution, you get nice lines which form these really cool trails that can be a different type of abstract animation if you want to do so. This also allows you to actually loop the animation by clipping it between 300 and 600, and in case you are clipping it at 300, make sure that you bake the animation before you change the start frame to 300. Apart from that, there's one last thing that you could do, which is changing the actual animation for this particular base object that we had from linear to Bezier, and that way these edges become nice and smooth instead of having a rough transition. So if you actually took a look at the keyframes that we had down here, we had the interpolation set to linear, but keeping it at Bezier makes it nice and smooth and gives it a much better feel in my opinion. If you want to know how to loop the previous animation with the random particles that we had, you could do that by, instead of using a scene time node, using a value node and keyframing the value to go up and down. If you want a detailed explanation on that, you can check out this video that's linked over here, and that way you'll be able to create loop for randomized particles as well. With that, let's get back to the original video. I really hope this was a fun one and you can use this creatively to create so many different types of animations. As usual, this was just a base concept, and there are many cooler ideas that I'm thinking of, which I definitely will be implementing very soon. So if you want to stay tuned for those videos as well, be sure to hit the subscribe button. And since I post videos every single day, there are a lot of content present on my channel that's just waiting for you to discover them. So until the next video comes out tomorrow, thank you so much for watching once again. Keep creating and stay creative.